Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now here's what we've got for you today. Following the popularity of one of our episodes last year with Peter Apps, author of Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen, and in anticipation of our future guest Russ Timpson, who is the conference director for the International Tall Building Highrise Fire Safety Conference, I thought we would just go through a couple of useful articles and pieces of information to give people a wider context around high-rise firefighting, and we're going to delve into a lot of work from a previous guest, Steve Dudney. We'll put a link for Steve's website in here as well, so you can go and look at this detail in more information and more depth. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the progression of firefighting in high-rise buildings. We're going to talk about the progression and proliferation of high-rise buildings across the UK and the world. And then through Steve's words, we're going to go into his career as he talks us through many of the developments that he saw as part of his career in our approaches, tactics and strategies in firefighting in high-rise buildings. We touch base and very briefly go over a number of high-rise incidents in a very short debrief style from Steve's words. And hopefully this helps gives you some greater insight. This helps give you some understanding of how far we've come, perhaps the origins and thought processes behind some of the tactics and equipment that we're using today. And as always, I hope you find a nugget of information that makes you better, safer, and more capable of doing your job moving forward. So without further ado, we'll jump in there and I will see you on the other side. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. So, high-rise. When you think about high-rise buildings, the first city that comes to mind is probably somewhere like New York, maybe Chicago, Los Angeles, or maybe you consider Hong Kong, Dubai. These are some really, really tall, high buildings, these places. But you rarely think of London, unless, of course, you live in the UK. London does have a lot of high-rise buildings. The most surprising fact about high-rise buildings in London is that it is only the past couple of decades that high-rise buildings have significantly increased in height, over that 150-metre modern definition that we think of. Now, the main reason for that being the clay bedrock on which London is built. Interesting fact, a lot of people didn't know. And long-standing restrictions on building height that go back, way back from the London Building Act of 1894. Now, the first true skyscraper in the City of London was a 183-metre NatWest Tower, completed in 1980, followed by the construction of the tallest building in Europe in 1991. This was the 235-metre Canada Square at Canary Wharf in London's Old Docklands area. In the years that followed, there has been a second high-rise revolution in London, with 40 buildings that are over the 150-metre benchmark and 118 buildings that are over the 100 metres, with the 310-metre Shard in Southwark being the tallest in London and the UK and Western Europe. In other news, this episode is brought to you in partnership with MSA Safety. Today we have them to thank for the improved firefighter safety through connectivity in their brand new connected firefighter system. At the center of the connected firefighter platform is the MSA M1 SCBA with telemetry. You can view battery life, air pressure, and estimated time remaining either independently on the M1 itself or from the Lunar connected device screen. Also, still with the air status, alarm information, search status, and all of this provided to the incident command for confident decision making during the scene. That integrates straight in with the Lunar system, which is a wireless all-in-one device creating an independent search and rescue network, providing edge detection, enhanced personal thermal imaging, while simplifying post-scene reporting and data retention. One of the key parts of the Luna is their FAST system, the Firefighting Assisting Search Technology. This combines directional and distance information with thermal imaging to help find separated teammates and decrease response time. It actually connects you to the other crews in the vicinity for a unified search during the time of mutual aid by instantly notifying the network of Luna devices when there is a downed crew member, allowing for a prompt search and rescue. All of this then plugs into the FireGrid system for cloud-based connectivity, real-time information, and data-driven decisions for the incident commander. It enables you to see the exact location of your firefighters on the scene. And it doesn't require you to be sat on the station. The MSA hub then provides a wireless gateway straight to the cloud, enabling wireless on-scene data for local and remote incident command for additional eyes on the scene. MSA are truly taking massive strides in the future of improved firefighter safety through connectivity. MSA is dedicated to increasing safety in the fire service through technological advancements. Various feature enhancements, new products, partnerships, and integrations will provide additional capabilities readily accessible by products, software, and services in the brand new MSA Connected Firefighter platform. Now back to the show. Now let's stretch even further back. High-rise building is not a feature of modern living. The ancient empires of Egypt, Greece, and Rome have examples of huge buildings and living accommodations of 6, 7, and even 8 floors. So it's not something we necessarily came up with. As time went on, construction of these tall buildings was generally limited to religious and civic buildings. The driving force behind the general take-up of high-rise buildings was the advances made during the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent population migration from rural to town and city living. As the towns and cities became overpopulated, the simplest expansion technique seemed to be to build higher. And the new technologies and monies coming out of the Industrial Revolution started to allow the building of very tall buildings. America was really the first country to start constructing tall buildings for general accommodation in the mid-19th century. Chicago, soon after New York, as we referenced earlier, embarked on ambitious high-rise developments. But as brick was the major construction material, the general limit to these buildings was about 10 floors, 10 stories. As advances were made, the quest for the true skyscraper was started in earnest, and by the turn of the 19th century, high-rise construction techniques had been all but perfected, or so we thought, and with the adoption of electrical lifts, high-rise living was an established fact. We were doing it. Back in the UK, high-rise building was primarily used to address chronic housing shortages following World War II. The Housing Act 1930 had started many local authorities in slum clearance and regeneration, but the outbreak of the war interrupted this. Post-war, the slum clearance program was restarted and a massive housing development program was started. That also had to replace the many properties that were bomb damaged. The pace of population growth was outrunning the supply of houses. Architects and planners favoured a modernist approach to the streets in the sky, as they called it. So when we overlay this on the concept of firefighting, in terms of high-rise firefighting, any building taller than the height of the fire service's tallest ladder could be considered high-rise. And traditionally, in terms of high-rise firefighting, anything over 18 metres, or 60 feet back then, was required to be fitted with facilities for firefighters such as dry rising mains for delivery water to the fire floor and protected staircases and a firefighting lift. Now, across the UK where the regulations apply, the number of residential buildings defined as high-rise is about 12,500. However, the definitive figures are not clear, and another study, which covers the administrative area covered by the London boroughs, in an eye-watering 44,000 buildings that are 18 metres or taller. This, of course, includes all types of buildings, both from offices to hospitals to hotels and many of the large medium-rise mansion blocks that dominate the tighter streets in central London, schools, colleges, warehouses, churches, and so on. It's unclear and difficult to find a definitive list, as many interested parties have different definitions. But as firefighters, we need to consider any building where, if a fire occurred, we would be required to adopt some form of high-rise firefighting where, instead of running hose lines from the street, we would need to establish a bridgehead at a level above ground but below the fire to begin firefighting and rescue operations. Now that number in both London and further afield across the UK will, we can be sure, run into the many tens of thousands. So those are where we historically had to employ a different set of tactics and thus were defined by the fire service at least as high-rise buildings, whether they are medium-rise, high-rise or skyscrapers that are seen from miles around. Since 2020, the landscape has changed even more. Following the fire at the Cube student accommodation block in Bolton, Greater Manchester, The regulations now apply to buildings with a top floor above 11 metres. The threshold for sprinklers to be fitted in residential accommodation was also reduced from 30 metres to 11 metres. This potentially brings the number of buildings in scope into the hundreds of thousands. Historically, in London as a specific, especially due to destruction of so much of the inner London area in the Blitz of World War II, but also in almost all of our towns and cities, the early 1960s saw the development of the traditional high-rise blocks of flats to replace many of the bomb ruins and dilapidated slums, as referenced before. Now, British Standard Code of Practice 3, 1962 as amended 1971, became the standard to which these buildings were designed and built on the premise that anyone who was in a fire above the height of a 50-foot wheeled escape ladder, with the addition of a 10-foot first floor ladder, 60-foot or 18 metres, was beyond external rescue by the first arriving firefighters. Thus, these flats were to be designed with each dwelling being a fire-resisting box. That would allow other people in the building to remain where they were and anyone affected by the fire to escape into fire-resisting corridors and make their way out of the building down a protected staircase. The building also fitted with means of firefighting, i.e. dry risers and the fireman's lift, to assist those sent to deal with the outbreak. Today's podcast is powered by our partner Lifelines and their revolutionary approach to functional hydration. Just like in firefighting, water is essential for body function, but studies show more than 80% of firefighters are dehydrated. A 25-year study findings from the National Institute of Health showed poor hydration to be linked to early aging and chronic disease, and even mild dehydration results in significant negative impact outcomes including headaches, exhaustion, rapid pulse, irritability, and poor cognitive function. A study conducted by Yale University showed that participants who were just 1% dehydrated had a 12% increase in errors when performing tasks that required cognitive flexibility. In addition, dehydration is shown to worsen mood and attitude, contribute to confusion and poor decision making, and negatively affect memory and judgment. In other words, you really don't want your incident commander, firefighter, or for that matter any first responder on a critical scene to be even slightly dehydrated. Mild dehydration occurs when a person is just 1.5% dehydrated, a condition that does not even trigger the thirst response in most people. So just imagine how quickly a firefighter or any first responder can and does become dehydrated in their day-to-day duties, which is why I address my hydration first thing every day with Lifelines. Go into the notes for this episode and specifically check out Lifeline's Hydro Fuel and Hydro OG by clicking in the notes for the podcast for a clean energy solution designed for those who demand more from their day. Now back to the show. This next portion is taken directly from Steve Doody's writing and is written from his perspective. As a child growing up in the East End of London in the 1970s, high-rise housing estates were all around me. In fact, my grandparents, having been moved out of their old terraced house in 1969, lived on the 11th floor of a 16-storey modern tower block. Occasionally there will be a fire in one of these blocks in the area, and although I don't have any specific memories before my own career began, I remember seeing the blackened scars of the fire in quite a few blocks over those years. My own career with the London Fire Brigade began in 1987, and it was just 12 short weeks after being posted to my first station that I was on standby duty at Homerton Fire Station in Hackney to cover a personal shortage that I attended my first serious high-rise fire. Although my training had been brutal, with harsh practical training drills and a head crammed with facts, figures and information on equipment, procedures, building construction, hydraulics, fire prevention, regulations and the like, I didn't particularly recall being taught very much about fighting fires in high-rise buildings. In fact, upon my arrival at the fire in a block of flats in Daubney Road in Homerton, it became apparent pretty quickly there was no recognised high-rise procedure, just a collection of locally agreed procedures based on the experience of fighting fires in these blocks, watch by watch, station by station. I was instructed, grab some breaking-in gear and follow me, by the sub-officer in charge of my appliance and along with everyone apart from the two drivers of the two pumps from Homerton. We bundled into the lifts and headed skywards. I do recall we took the lifts to the floor below the fire but were soon on the fire floor, with smoke seeping from behind the door to the flat. Recognising we had a job, the two BA men started their sets and I was thrust a roll of Dutch roll 45mm and told to set in. The door was kicked in and one of the officers crabbed his way into the flat. The landing immediately filled with smoke, forcing us all to the floor for clean air. I bowled the hose out and more by accident than design, found myself next to the glass door dry rising main outlet. Coughing in the smoke, I used my axe to break the Georgian wired glass cover to the door. Rather unsuccessfully, because of the wire in the glass, and then as I reached through the hole to open the door, I cursed as I caught my wrist on the sharp broken glass. Those were the final days of loose cuffed woolen fire tunics and red rubber debris gloves. so fire protection, let alone hard protection from sharp objects, was still a year or so away. I plugged the hose in, and on the call of water on took a breath, stood up to wind open the valve on the dry riser outlet, literally licking my wounded wrist. I don't remember much more than just putting up with the snot and tears from the smoke, as everyone else seemed to be coping with it. But despite all of this read in horror through the lens of modern firefighting in 2023, the fire was out very quickly, and I was soon standing again in the steamy atmosphere of the burnt-out flat. That was my first experience of high-rise firefighting. There was no procedure, but everyone had a role, albeit mine was given to me at the time in short, gruff commands. The right equipment was taken up, 2 lengths of 45mm and a hand control branch, the BA control board, braking in gear, and 2 of the firefighters, those being deployed for search, rescue and firefighting, being equipped with BA. The fundamentals of which are still recognised in high-rise firefighting in the UK today. I also added this first of many layers of firefighting and fire in tall building to what was then a very lean library of experience. There was no debrief as such. I was scolded for cutting my wrist, but also loosely commended for having the hose laid out, plugged in, and ready for water on when it was called for. I made some mental notes as to what I'd do again and what I'd not do, i.e. cut my wrist, but didn't particularly concern myself with the myriad of issues I'd consider and eventually be responsible for when in command of large high-rise fires decades into the future. I quickly grew to realise that firefighting in high-rise buildings was a regular part of what we did in those days. In fact, Hamilton was just north of my own station, Bethnal Green, and close to the borders of the 2 stations where 2 blocks of the notorious Kingshold estate, that rather like the Bronx in New York City in the 70s, people were regularly burning themselves out of to escape the crime and miserable living conditions. So scarred by fire were these 2 buildings that they were named Beirut Towers by local firefighters, as their outside appearance began to resemble a bomb-damaged building seen on the TV news at the time of the Lebanese Civil War. By 1989 I transferred to Poplar Fire Station, close to where I lived back then. This area in particular had suffered badly in the Blitz, so the proliferation of high-rise housing estates in the area was higher than in most other parts of London and the UK. In addition, the Canadian development company Olympia in York won the contract to start the biggest development in the world at the time, the 83 acres of Canary Wharf in the West India Docks, constructing what was, at that time, locally called Mini Manhattan because of the number of tall office blocks that were proposed. Little did we know that by 2023, that area would contain over 50 commercial and residential buildings, 27 of which are over 100 metres in height. The site is now laid out over 128 acres. It has 5 of the 10 tallest buildings in London, and is home to the tallest residential block in Western Europe at an eye-watering 77 stories. Back then, the response in terms of the regulatory regime was immense. LFB had their own team of fire safety officers and engineers working with the developers, and the initial response to calls to fires or fire alarms on the estate was increased to 4 pumps, an aerial, and a command unit. But from a tactical point of view, no one was interested. No one listened. Us, the firefighters at Poplar and surrounding stations, were to deal with a fire in an open plan office, consuming highly combustible workstations on the 48th floor of number 1, Canada Square, as we would a mattress burning in a bedroom on the 8th floor of the nearby Fitzgerald House, one of the dozens of late 1960s council high-rise blocks on the patch. We developed our own ways of responding to Canary Wharf, and inevitably this bled over into our response to other blocks. This was often on a watch-by-watch, shift-by-shift basis across local stations, with the Red Watch doing something slightly different to the White Watch and so on. I recall over the years bags carrying nozzles and ancillary equipment, a large spare equipment tray from one of the fire engines full of gear, and yes, even back then, we were experimenting with different hose packs. On Red Watch at Poplar, at the change of shift, we would unroll 2 lengths of 45mm lay flat hose and repack it as flake length for ease of deployment. We further recognised the old AWG nozzle was next to useless and campaigned to get a modern combination nozzle added to replace it. The nozzle of choice was the high-flow smooth-bore Noble branch, which was good for around 900 to 1,000 litres per minute of water delivery. Yet in 1998, when LFB were late to the party, after most of the UK fire and rescue services had long since been using combination nozzles, they introduced a superb Acron combination nozzle. But the people behind the desks instead of behind the hoses decided not only to ditch the elderly OWG, but also the Noble, cutting our ability to deliver high volumes of water at low pressures by half overnight. The secret to effective high-rise firefighting, as the dry rise and wet risers were designed exactly to work with high-flow, low-pressure nozzles. As my career progressed, I was never far from Poplar. In other parts of East End of London, with a similar profile of tall blocks of flats, all of which were gradually slipping down the scale in terms of their state of repair and unfortunately tenancy. The generation of post-war tenants like my grandparents were dying out in the 80s and 90s. The tower block was no longer desirable, so the new occupants tended to be transient, or the flats empty and used by squatters, drink or drug dependent people, or youngsters, each of which massively increased the likelihood of a fire starting. We continued to manage with locally agreed on-arrival tactics, and despite constant knocking on closed doors by those of us in various parts of London who had a particular vocational interest and desire to improve our lot, the situation remained unchanged. I can recall attending many fires where I was part of an initial BA attack team or backup team, the driver, pump operator, where the slightest miscalculation in the positioning of the first pumping appliance might mean the difference between two drivers running out 4 or 8 lengths of hose to get a hydrant supply and then feed that into the dry rise and main. As a junior officer, I was charged with the initial command decision making from the base of the building, or taking a role that we now call the fire sector commander. At the area below the fire, we now call the bridgehead. By the early 2000s, I was back at Poplar and was acting up as station commander from my base post of rider station officer on the White Watch at that station. A number of major global events in the first years of the new millennium were a prompt for the fire service to review fires in tall buildings, the most obvious being the September 11th attacks in the USA. In the UK, this prompted the setting up of the BDAG, Building Disaster Assessment Group, by the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, who, at that time, were responsible for the fire and rescue service in the UK. The group reported on the physiological effects of firefighting in tall buildings on firefires, the relationship between building design and firefighting, water supplies for firefighting in tall buildings, and communication systems in large, complex buildings, among other project streams. Furthermore, there were a number of significant fires during this time that called current practice into question. In 2001, 2 serious high-rise fires occurred within weeks of each other in Kent. Both were fatal fires involving internal spread beyond the flats of origin, requiring multiple internal and external rescues and injuries to firefighters responding to the incident. In July 2003, a serious fire occurred in Tesla House, a 1960s office block in Paddington, West London. The block was not required to have sprinklers, and due to the warm weather, windows were left open. The fire was able to spread from the 7th floor to the 11th floor before it was brought under control. The fire loading in this block was greater than that at the first interstate bank fire in Los Angeles in 1988. 2 firefighters were injured, one seriously, whilst attempting to fight the fire using accepted high-rise firefighting tactics in these large open-planned offices that were completely consumed by fire. The only thing that brought the fire under control was that it was on a relatively low floors, where external aerial monitors and handheld hose lines from neighbouring buildings were able to provide sufficient volume of water to overcome the fire. Had this building been taller and the fire occupied an upper floor, it would have potentially burned until it reached the top of the building. Similar to Tesla House, a fire occurred in Tall Windsor, Windsor Tower, a 32-storey office building in Madrid. This fire started on the 21st floor, and with the same tactical limitations that occurred at Tesla House, but beyond the reach of the external aerial water streams, and fire burned for 24 hours, consuming the entire upper part of the building and led to a number of floors to collapse. 7 firefighters were injured at the fire. Also in 2005, a wind-driven fire on the 15th floor of a residential block of flats in Stevenage in Hertfordshire killed a resident of the flat and also killed firefighters Michael Miller and Jeff Wordham. They were completely overwhelmed as the windows failed, catching them in a powerful blowtorch of fire just as they entered the flat to rescue the trapped resident. It's fair to say that some of the local ad hoc changes to tactics and procedures followed these events, but the clear outcomes of the BDAG reports never actually translated in significant change. The Department of Communities and Local Government, DCLG, which took responsibility for the fire service after ODPM published a series of operational guides that were called Generic Risk Assessments, GRA 3.2, was specific to fighting fires in high-rise buildings. The early version of the GRA was another publication that focused and highlighted many of the risks associated with fires in tall buildings and provided an improved emphasis on incident command that included setting up a bridgehead and vertical sectorization. But only one of the 22 pages of this version discussed firefighting and rescue, and that was primarily focused on abnormal fire development phenomena such as flashover and backdraft. It is noted though that the 2004 update of this document, in line with the more recent active approach to high-rise firefighting, increased to 64 pages in total, including appendices with several pages dedicated to actions beyond the bridgehead. Closer to home for me, following 9/11, the LFB's Health and Safety Department tasked an experienced officer to write a risk analysis for high-rise firefighting. I was consulted from time to time on this, and as it began to shape up, although I was disappointed that the area of London I covered, with the unusual number of both residential and commercial high-rise building, were not among the stations used to gather data, this extensive document remains for me to date the most comprehensive analysis of the associated risks related to the high-rise firefighting I have ever read. Almost every issue, obstacle or nuance that colleagues and I had ever come across have been included, as well as others we hadn't. Although the report itself was a presentation of the potential problems and pitfalls, it was enshrined in health and safety law, with overarching reminders of the duty of employers to provide a safe and effective workplace, entitling them to effectively solve the issues. Tragically, the officer who was responsible for this project died following a short illness when the completed document was still in draft form. Although I still have and refer to this document today, I'm not aware the report or its findings were ever published, let alone acted upon. In the summer of 2009, in London, another fine breezy summer's day had an impact on a high-rise fire. Lackadal House is a 14-storey block of maisonettes built in 1959 with a complex construction where each maisonette interlocks or scissors across its neighbour. Access is via the enclosed internal landings on the odd floors. On the access level, there are 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, and stairs to the upper level where the lounge and kitchen stretch across the full width of the block. This means that the lounge for each flat is above one of the bedrooms of the flat, and one of the bedrooms of the flat on the opposite side of the access corridor. The flats were built with fire exits from the lounge and the kitchen to the exit balconies on either side of the building, and also a fire exit from the largest bedroom into the central access corridor, separate from the front door. This even sounds confusing reading it back. The fire itself started in a defective television on the 9th floor bedroom of the maisonette that was laid on the 9th and 10th floors. The fire developed within the room, and because of the warm temperatures, the windows in the room were open, allowing for a good supply of air to assist the fire's development. Fire spread through the maisonette, eventually breaking out of windows on both sides of the block. The exterior cladding panels beneath the windows had failed within 5 minutes, allowing for a much quicker spread of flame externally than was anticipated. In addition to this, a warm breeze of the day blowing against a large slab-sided block allowed air current to move down as well as up. This allowed debris to fall from the initial fire to be blown into open windows on lower floors, starting additional fires on the 5th and then 3rd floor maisonettes. A third issue was poor fire stopping between the maisonettes and common areas. Redevelopment over the years had led to the initial design of each individual dwelling as a fire-resisting concrete box to become compromised, allowing smoke and fire to permeate into the common hallways and spread fire into these at all levels where dwellings were now on fire. This had a dramatic effect on firefighting. Crews who would have started on the bridgehead 2 floors below the fire and would have been able to approach the scenes of each fire relatively easily were now forced to withdraw to the lowest level of the building and fight their way up and into each level. Sadly, 6 people were unable to escape their properties because of the spread of fire and smoke, and firefighting crews were unable to reach them quickly to effect a rescue. As referenced in a previous episode, this fire also called into question, for the first time, the stay-put strategy. Part of the fundamental principles of the British Standard Code of Practice 3 was, to quote it directly, owing to the high degree of compartmentation provided in dwellings in modern blocks, the spread of fire and smoke from one dwelling to another, and the need to evacuate the occupants of adjoining dwellings are unusual. The occupants should be safe if they remain where they are. This had obviously led to the fire service control room stating that this sound advice that had no doubt worked effectively in many hundreds, if not thousands, of high-rise fires over the previous 5 decades. Remote from the scene, they were blind to how the building was failing and how the fire was spreading. It was only a few months after this I was ordered onto a fire in a high-rise building close to Canary Wharf. The block is a 33-storey modern structure with a hotel making up the first 12 floors and high-end residential apartments from the 13th to the 32nd floors. Unbeknown to us until quite a way into the incident, the fire was actually limited to a cooking range in the kitchen of the ground floor restaurant. This had been evacuated, but no one from the restaurant had approached the fire service. They were just stood among the crowds who were evacuated due to the actuation of the fire detection system. The fire had spread partially into the ducting above the cooking range that, for what is assumed aesthetic reasons, did not exhaust to the outside of the sleek building but instead went up inside a service duct 111 metres to the roof. This duct was adequately fire-stopped throughout the hotel, but in the apartment part of the block, the smoke from the ducting was able to escape and seep onto each landing. Although the initial call was to the fire alarm in the hotel, LFB control were soon receiving multiple calls to fire at various levels on the apartment block. En route to the incident, I was aware of a constant radio traffic to the first arriving appliances from Poplar, many of which stated people were trapped. Prospect was horrific, but with Lacanau on my mind, I was determined to try and get ahead of it. I arrived and was the first senior officer on scene. I managed a very quick handover from the watch commander at Poplar, and then dispatched a station commander who had arrived just behind me to take command of the bridgehead, which I had notionally set up on the lowest possible level as we had calls from the 13th to the 31st floors. I gave a message to a firefighter to make the job up to a 10-pump fire, and then began to consider my tactical plan. Having sent someone to do a 360, I was at least satisfied that we didn't have an extensive visual fire, but more confused as to what was causing so many calls. My tactical gambit was to send whole crews in BA, including their officer, each with the equipment to set up a high-rise fire attack in the bridgehead, with each then deployed to search separate floors to identify the location of the fire and start firefighting and rescue, when and if they found it, to immediately inform me and the bridgehead. I was working outside of policy using operational discretion, but was left with no choice due to the higher life risk. The senior and very experienced control commander on duty that night recognised that a significant fire survival call event was underway. Using his own initiative, he effectively came up with what was to become LFB's fire survival guidance policy at the moment in time. He made a decision to send an additional command unit to the scene, in addition to the one that was my command vehicle, and also an additional pump so their crew could assist in collating the information. When they arrived, we were very quickly able to collate the details of the people in the 22 premises that were on the phone to LFB control stating they were trapped. During this time, fire in the cooking range was identified and dealt with, although residual smoke remained, and those on the phone were informed that the fire had been dealt with. The reality with any and all fire survival guidance calls is, whether the fire is small or severe, or just smoke moving about the building, whether or not those people are in any danger in actual fact, they believe they are in danger, and the fire service needs to respond to that quickly and effectively, as their perception and fear could lead them to take drastic measures, such as jumping from upper floors or attempting to escape by irregular and dangerous means, such as drain pipes or bedsheets. The recommendations from the Lacanau House inquiry that were eventually released were significant. The Rule 43 findings, alongside the findings from the Shirley Towers fire in Southampton in 2010, where firefighters Alan Bannon and James Shears were killed, and those from the Harrow Court fire in 2005, amounted to significant requirements for change in the way fires in tall buildings were fought, as well as how they were constructed, maintained, and used. These recommendations were wide-ranging and far-reaching. It is not practical or appropriate to discuss them here. Even in their most basic headline form, there were implications for multiple stakeholders such as fire and rescue services, local authorities, government departments, and the fire industry generally. It is a matter of record that these recommendations were adopted, considered, or dismissed by various stakeholders, which led us to the early hours of June 14, 2017. It is fair to say that nationally, the fire service responded to a significant degree. I was personally involved in the discussions around the updating of GRA 3.2, although, as stated by Richard Millett QC at the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, when interviewing a witness in relation to this update, some of the issues relating to fire spread between dwellings and the ability for modern combination nozzles to work effectively from low-pressure dry risers that I had argued for were overlooked. The desire in LFB to reduce the predetermined attendance to a fire in high-rise buildings had thankfully not been materialised, but was still, in my opinion, verified years earlier by the Fire Brigade Union Critical Attendance Standards document, still dangerously short of personnel. But improvements in equipment, command, fire survival guidance had advanced with a limited improvement in the tactical response. The fire at Grenfell Tower that was started in the early hours of June 14, 2017, was the worst fire incident the UK has ever seen. 72 people died in a fire that was a tragic culmination of events that never should have happened, and never should have been allowed to happen. However, the response to the disaster from all areas of society was as rapid as it was prodigious. At the time, I was LFB's Borough Commander for Hackney. While I was still at the scene of Grenfell Tower during the day, I missed a number of calls from local officials, and before the week was out, had been with strategic partners and housing leaders across the area, where rapid plans were put in place to assess and report on the range of issues concerning all high-rise blocks in the borough. The response from LFB was absolute relief and vindication of what all of us with an interest in high-rise firefighting had argued in favour of for a long time. Any call to a fire in a high-rise building was now to attract 5 pumping appliances and an aerial platform. Multiple calls would attract a full attendance to an 8-pump fire, including ancillary vehicles and senior officers. That was game-changing. But so was the environment we worked in. With so many tall buildings in London, especially residential blocks, fires occur in them on a weekly basis. There is generally a significant fire in one every couple of weeks, but now the landscape has changed. Just days after Grenfell Tower, a fire occurred in a second-floor flat in Holloway. It wasn't significant for an inner city, but the reaction was understandably dramatic. It appeared that the whole block had self-evacuated once the fire had become visible. A person was injured when they jumped from a lower floor window, and responding crews were fighting against the tide of residents running down the stairs and out of the building. The management of the crowd and the safety implications of the public and firefighters added a new dynamic to the response to the fires in high-rise buildings. Stay put, it appears, was dead in the water. The response from the operational level at fire stations was also significantly improved. Familiarisation visits, increased community fire safety, checks for access for fire appliances, with an emphasis on the technical understanding of the construction and fire protection measures within these buildings. Because of the new mobilising protocols, where 3 or more calls attracted that full response, I found myself being sent out pretty much straight away, either in the command role as a group commander or as a regulatory fire safety tactical advisor. My last year in LFB was certainly not a steady wind down into retirement. In my last 3 weeks, I was in command of 2 significant high-rise fires, one in Edmonton in North London and one on my own patch, Bow, in East End, where, because of its locality to my office, meant I arrived at the very start and was able to get a significant grip on the incident very early on. This was an unusual perspective for someone in my position. Although the crews around me were my own, I knew them and the junior officers well. It was a rewarding experience to be able to influence early command decision making and suggest the tactical approach, as well as see the plan in action from the outset. The fire was on the 12th floor and had fully developed a flashover stage by the time we arrived, but it was dealt with very quickly, set against the backdrop of most of the block self-evacuating and external flame spread. I'd come a long way in my journey. I stood there 30 plus years and 3 miles from the scene of my first high-rise fire on Daubney Road, Homerton, thinking this was a perfect high-rise swan song. Everything that I knew and understood no longer seemed a frustrating conflicting of theory versus reality. We all spoke the same language. Everyone knew their role and how to perform that role. The equipment, including the choice of higher flowing modern nozzles, was entirely suited and appropriate, including a proper bag of high-rise kit, including Cleveland hose bags. It had been a long journey and had been frustrating and had ultimately taken a major tragedy to get there. But I left feeling high-rise firefighting in London and the UK was getting close to where it should be. That brings us to the end of the author Steve Dudney's blog article on high-rise. Following his retirement in July 2008, the training and tactical understanding in LFB and nationally continued to improve immensely. Again, as referenced at the beginning, we'll soon be having a guest on, Director of International Tall Building and High-Rise Fire Safety Conference, and there has been some significant developments, not only in the UK but across the world. We've seen huge steps forward in the use and adaptability of TLs and aerial ladders as they become a bigger part of the response systems of any tactical approach to high-rise firefighting in the UK. However, there's still a lot of work to go. New procedures have and are often debated, with lots of controversy and lots of different ideas and input, with conflict arising between fire service leaders and, of course, the fire brigade union representatives. But it's important to reflect on how far we have come since the origin of people like Steve's and so many other people's careers, and the progress, in fairness, has been outstanding. If, again, you want to learn some more information from the references in today's episode, you can head to Steve Dude, that's Sierra Tango Echo, Victor Echo, Delta Uniform Delta Echo 68.com. And in the beginning, we also read some outtake from highrisefirefighting.co.uk. I hope this has been insightful and useful for yourselves. I wanted to share it on the podcast because Steve's a close friend of mine and I think he has some significant knowledge on this, and also he's a great writer. The Firefighters Podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you are in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.